started. I want to welcome everyone here. We're so grateful that you were able to attend this talk today. And we are so honored to have Mr. Garner here. We are. I have a very long list of accomplishments. I'll just mention.
Oh, please don't put him to sleep.
Okay, well, Kurt is an architectural historian. He has degrees in business administration and architecture. He's founder of and president of the Withogan Valley Preservation Association. And I think Withogan is the Native American Yellow River. Yes. Okay. Our own Yellow River in Marshall County. He's also co-founder and president of Indiana's Historic Michigan Road Byway Association. Served on Indiana's landmark Northern Regional Council. A former Plymouth City Councilman, a current Marshall County Commissioner, and I could go on and on. Certainly well qualified to talk about our Carnegie Library. May is National Historic Preservation Month, and 2015 is the year when our Carnegie Library, you're sitting downstairs, celebrates 100 years. And we brought the two together. We have Mr. Kurt Garner to talk about basically Carnegie Library architecture and our Carnegie in particular. So, I'm done.
All right.
We give it to
Well, it's such a beautiful day. Of course, it's always a beautiful day in Culver, right? It's always a Chamber of Commerce day. But, either you guys are really, really interested in this presentation, or you're trying to get out of yard work. One of the two. I have yard work waiting for me when I get home. Just a kudos. I know there's several antiquarians that are here, and you guys have really kind of encouraged the preservation effort in Culver and the love for history that you have down here. I love coming to Culver. In fact, I always kid that my satellite office is over at the Culver Coffee Lodge, or Culver Coffee Company. So it's when I come down here, I usually try to group a lot of meetings together, and I have people over there that I meet with. So. Well, let me tell you a little bit about, I guess, how I kind of got into this situation where I'm giving this presentation. 2 years ago, Plymouth celebrated their 100th anniversary of their library. And of course, Plymouth does not have their Carnegie Library any longer, but they did have a Carnegie Library, and it's exactly where the current library is. And they asked me to pull a presentation together, and in the work that I do across the state with research and National Register districts, a number of the communities that I go into have Carnegie Libraries. So usually as part of a district or individually, we would list that to the National Register. One of the more interesting ones is in Monticello. Has anybody been to the Monticello Museum, which is their former Carnegie Library? It's the only one in Indiana that actually has a corner entry. And it's kind of an interesting little building. And then somebody had sent me, forwarded, the folks from Greenville, Illinois here? Okay, that's probably the most unusual Carnegie that I've seen. Pretty standard if you just looked at it without this big corner tower on the corner of the front part of the building. And I'm not sure how they got away with that, because shortly after Carnegie started to be constructed, the Carnegie Foundation, or whoever it was that was promoting that at the time, they would review architectural plans, and in fact, Plymouth got their hands slapped because they were a little too, it was a little too nice. So I'm not exactly sure how that happened. I don't know if there was some public money that was coming in, just from the community. But we'll talk about Carnegie's, and there's a book that I'll refer to, and actually I got a lot of information from. It's called Temples of Knowledge. So I pulled that out, and so many of these Carnegie libraries, they look like temples, and that was a design feature that was, very much intended. I put down there because we're in a library. Put that pointed the right direction. Whoop. I'm going to talk just a little bit about, the library movement that was happening, and this happened nationally, but in Indiana there were a few things that happened that were a little different than the rest of the country. There was a Marshall County Library Association that was organized in Plymouth in 1837. All right? So that was the first entry. Marshall County was founded in 1836. So a year later, they formed this library association. Books were loaned with proper bonds, which means you probably had to leave your driver's license, right? A person had 1 week to read a 100-page book and 2 weeks to read a 200-page book. That was written into the rules. I would fail at this. The county commissioners took charge of the library in 1845, and then a year later, 330 volumes were purchased. So it wasn't for 1840s, it's a pretty decent-sized library. The county recorder was the librarian, so it was housed in the county building, or in the county courthouse, and it was housed in the recorder's office. By about 1900, only 50 books remained, so obviously some of those never came back. Librarians never have that problem, right? Due to patrons not returning books, the county sold the remaining volumes rather than purchasing new books. So that was the end of the Marshall County Library Association. Oh, sorry, I'll get it right. Then in 1851, there was an organization that formed called the Young Men's Library Association. And this was the article that appeared in the Pilot News. Come fathers, mothers, and guardians, rouse up, pull down the dark curtains of ignorance, and you will see the bright and beautiful temple of knowledge, which I think is where that came from, the title of the book. Fading and sparkling with crown, reeds, and jewels in the groves of science. That appeared in the Pilot News in 1851. What was happening at this time is there was a fellow named Robert McClure. Has anybody been to New Harmony and understand the history of New Harmony a little bit? Well, McClure had a considerable amount of wealth, and he encouraged the formation of these libraries. And so for $500, the establishment of a library could be made, in communities or in counties. So this bottom picture is actually an early picture of New Harmony, where the original McClure's Working Men's Library Association was created. So in 1851, 1858, there were kind of two things going on in Marshall County and in Plymouth with these formations of these library associations. It's just so touchy. Then really what kind of set the stage for the development of libraries across the county were just these simple, basic township libraries. After the Civil War, an act of the state legislature allowed the creation of township libraries, primarily for use by children. So by about 1900, their popularity had waned, and most books had been distributed throughout the township schools. So if you imagine the township librarian the township could create or develop a library, and then, of course, townships had, anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 schools, right? Township schools. So those books were being dispersed amongst the township schools. Well, what was happening by about 1900 is also consolidation was coming into play. So as the township schools closed, the books, had already kind of been scattered around. So, their popularity had been decreasing by about 1900. So, enter Andrew Carnegie, and this is probably the most famous picture of him. It's the one that hangs in most Carnegie libraries. Carnegie said, "A man who dies rich dies disgraced." By 1899, Carnegie Steel Corporation controlled 1/4 of steel production in the United States. That's huge, because you imagine all the railroads that were being built, all the steel buildings that were now being built, because they had taken the place of masonry. So, steel was huge in the United States at the turn of the century. Carnegie sold his company to U.S. Steel in 1901 and retired to, quote, give away his amassed fortune. Carnegie funded 2,509 libraries. Can you imagine that? With $55 million. Indiana was the recipient of more Carnegie libraries than any other state in the Union. 164 were constructed at a cost of $2.6 million. This is amazing to me. Carnegie had distributed over 90% of his wealth by the time of his death in 1919. 90% of his wealth. I don't recall that I got any of that. Still waiting for the check to come in. Here's another really neat quote by Carnegie. The man who enters a library is in the best society the world offers. Goshen was the recipient of the first Carnegie Library in Indiana. That happened in 1901. The last was approved for Lowell in 1918. And the Carnegie Library in Goshen now is the city council, or city chambers, the mayor's office. Most gifts to libraries were between $5,000, Monterey, so one in that lower range, and $100,000 for larger communities, larger population bases like the one in Indianapolis. Architect Wilson B. Parker of Indianapolis is responsible for designing about a quarter of Indiana's Carnegie libraries. So he was kind of the Carnegie go-to guy. And I'm going to mention him in just a little bit again. Carnegie had the following requirements. So you submitted, you got an architect, you submitted the plans, and they reviewed them. These were the types of things that had to be in place for you to submit the plans and for them to grant you funds for the library. The library board had to be established. I'm sorry, am I stepping away? I've got to stay in my circle. A tax levy had to be in place for supporting the library for long-term support. The site had to be acquired, so that they would not give you money for land. You had to acquire the site. And then approval of the architectural plans. So Carnegie actually would approve those plans, or his people would approve those plans. The buildings were typically designed in the colonial classical revival style. Just kind of a basic revival. We'll talk about that in a little bit. With a central entry and raised first floor to allow windows in the basement. And also, and I noticed that you guys have a projection room, so this was used as an auditorium. That was also pretty frequently a feature in Carnegie libraries. The one in Rowan, Indiana has a very similar setup to this. So let's talk about Culver's Carnegie Library. There it is, on that kind of raised platform, right, with the windows in the basement, and then the entry, which is a little atypical of Carnegie libraries. Most of them had the portico entry, and I'll explain what that is in just a second. Just a real brief history. Of course, there's the picture up on the right-hand side of the screen. In 1914, Culver's civic leaders expressed an interest in developing a Carnegie library like other nearby towns had done. This time, Culver would have had one, or excuse me, Plymouth would have had one, and also Monterey. 3 rooms above Dr. Tallman's building were used during the formation of the library, and then later the second floor of the Mentor block was used. And I see Jeff there, and I think he probably pumped those buildings out maybe after we're done. By November of 2014, the newly formed library board applied for a Carnegie grant to build. And then on January 6, 1915, a letter from the Carnegie Corporation announced a $10,000 grant to the Culver Library. Businessmen along Main Street were committed then to raise the remaining $1,450 to purchase the building site. So this site was purchased by donations from the businessmen along Main Street. The building opened to the public on December 30th, 1915, and then books were donated by the public, and that's what formed the library's collection. And that happened a lot with Carnegie libraries. They would do these book drives to get the initial collection started. And then Miss Zola Moss earned all of $25 per month to be the first librarian. And I don't think that has the pay gone up significantly since then?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. I want to make sure you're taken care of. Well, let's talk about the architect and the contractor here for just a second. The architect's name was True L. Brookie of Indianapolis, and he was responsible for a few other Carnegie libraries. One in Kingman that was built in 1913 in the Craftsman style. In Indiana, there were, with Parker and Brookie, there seemed to be a little bit of a variety to the styles that were used. Typically, they were colonial and classical. But you do see a few of these kind of craftsman-style libraries that were built as well. He also did the Lawrenceburg Library in 1915. That's in the neoclassical style. In Monon, he built or designed the one in 1915 in kind of a Craftsman Renaissance Revival style, and it's probably most similar to what this library looks like. But that was done by Brookie and Parker. For whatever reason, for a short, brief time, they formed this partnership, and I don't know if that was because maybe somebody knew Parker and they said, well, you know, we kind of want him looking over the drawings too. I don't know. But that was just in Monon. That was the only time that they came together to do that. In Newcastle, Brookie did their library in 1916 in the Tudor Gothic style. And in Rockville in 1916 in the Georgian Revival style, which is also kind of a colonial revival style. And then the last one was in Mooresville in 1916, and that was in kind of a Tudor Gothic style. The contractor was Milo Cutshall of Akron, and he did two other libraries. One was in Akron, hired a local guy, and that was in the neoclassical style. And the other one was in Rowan, and that was done in the Craftsman style. And that's the picture in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And the Rowan library is individually listed on the National Register, and that's the one that I said had a similar setup with the projection. We're going to see the whole presentation twice by the time I'm done. Jeff Kinney forwarded these photos to me, and I just think they're great. This was the library in the 1960s, and you just get a feel for what it was like then, and probably not so different than when it was built 50 years prior to this. This lower left-hand corner, the picture was labeled planting grass. I think they're actually planting a tree, and I just wonder, this would have been about at the 50-year mark, and I just wonder if it's possible that tree was planted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the library. And I don't know, it could be, is it that tree that's out there? No. You can see if you look real close, you can see that little twig there. I don't know if, if it's still there, but anyway, that's the library in the 1960s. We'll talk a little bit about the architectural style. The colonial revival style, that was based on this kind of resurgence or interest in American history. And it kind of gained popularity after the Bicentennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, where it was heralded as an, I think that's supposed to say the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. I apologize for that. I've got Indiana Bicentennial on my brain. Where it was heralded as an expression of the American identity. The style became increasingly popular in the early 1900s and remained a desired style through the first half of the 20th century. This revival of the style was borrowed from colonial America in form and ornamentation. Sometimes you have these kind of true and fast kind of styles applied to buildings, okay? Brookie was an architect. And architects like to put their own spin on things. So we'll call this colonial revival. There are features of this building that may not be quite similar to typical colonial revival styles, but that's because you hired an architect and they're going to put their own mark on it. That's what we do. But when they started using colonial revival, that was a whole genre of different building styles, really, that they were looking at when they started doing this in 1876 and into the 1900s. There was Georgian Revival, there was Cape Cod, there was all of the things that we think of as colonial architecture in America. That was the revival that they started using. So like Dutch colonial, and I'm probably giving out terms that hopefully some of you are familiar with. But those were the types of buildings that were being brought back into use or back into popularity, those styles, by about 1900. Here's some typical examples of the colonial revival style. Obviously the library is on the right-hand side. But both of these are homes, and I just pulled these off the internet, so don't ask where they're at, I'm not sure. But they could be just about any house in any early 20th century neighborhood in the United States, right? The top one is pretty similar. There's a number of homes that are built on the north side off Academy Drive, north of the campus, that are in that colonial revival style. So it was familiar to Culver when this library was built. The one in the lower right-hand corner, you see some very obvious similarities between that and the Culver Library. This is just in case. So you see this feature right here in the bracketed cornice along here. You got it almost exactly duplicated here. And no, I'm sure this was not designed by Brookie. But you know, that would be very typical of that kind of colonial revival style. See, I push forward because I think forward is reverse on this. And then right around the corner, you've got the post office that was built in the colonial revival style. Obviously not until, I think it was in the 30s, right? But, you know, it's almost like they kind of looked at the library and said, you know what, that kind of makes sense. That period of time during the 30s, most post offices were built in either what we call starved classicism, which means a classical revival style that does not have a lot of the wow features of most classical architecture, or in kind of a starved colonial style and similar, you know, it wouldn't have the real robust kind of features that you would find like on the library. But typical features of that would be like these keystones, which you don't have here, but you've got the same kind of, this is called a broken pediment or pedimented entry, and that's something that you have here. And almost always kind of typically raised on this base, and again you have that here in the library. Now, I think I referenced the book. If I didn't, I apologize, and I'm going to grab it here, which means I'm leaving my circle. There's a fellow named McPherson that published the book. Do you have this book here at the library?
I do.
Okay, so rush out. Be the first one to sort of check it out. He did a book on all the Carnegie libraries in Indiana. Okay, even the ones that are no longer extant, the ones that have been razed or demolished, they're also in here. He references the Culver Library as Renaissance Revival. I disagree with Mr. McPherson, but I'll show you why I think he did that. The Renaissance Revival style was something that was happening. The Renaissance Revival style was happening at the turn of the century, but really much later into the century. So late 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, and this is something that would be typical of a Renaissance Revival style building or home. And this is probably why, you know, there are some things that are similar, but this is still colonial revival, especially with the broken pedimented entry, which is not typically found in Renaissance. It's almost always whole. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say broken pediment? A pediment is what typically crowns a temple. Okay, so you think Greek revival or Greek style, they had these pediments on top of their temples. And a pedimented entry would be similar. You'd have columns on either side and the pediment on top. The Renaissance rarely ever broke the pediment. Colonial did. The other thing that he might have been looking at to determine Renaissance revival is on most Renaissance revival style buildings, there's this kind of long first floor windows that were typically almost like French doors, okay? And almost always they were big casement types of windows that would open onto maybe some kind of porch. And here you see these little, almost like little balcony kind of window boxes. That was very typical of Renaissance. And I think that he probably looked at this because of the casements and then this treatment below the windows, almost as kind of a nod to that style. But I disagree. But you know, I didn't print a book either, so you know, kudos to Mr. McPherson. But So if you pick up that book and you flip in and you see the Culver Library and you say, wait a minute, I thought Kurt said that this was Colonial Revival. I'm going to stand that it's Colonial Revival. But just be aware that if you look at that, you're going to see Renaissance. I think that's it. I want to thank Colleen and Jeff back there for forwarding information and photographs. I do appreciate that. And I just wish you, congratulations, it's 100 years and you still have your building. Plymouth does not. But I will make this comment, and I know that the addition was some source of some concern here. I'm a pretty strict preservationist, and people that know me know that is true. But this is what I think. There's value to layering history. What Pete remembers as Culver, for a few years ago, I'm not going to go way back. But what Pete remembers about Culver is different than what Jeff is going to remember about Culver. And those layers of history are just as important to Pete as they are to Jeff. And so, if everything looked the same in town, it wouldn't feel like history. So there's a layering that's involved, and the prime example is downtown Plymouth. What would downtown Plymouth be without the Reese Theater? Well, the Reese Theater came almost 100 years after some of the other buildings in town were built. So there's a continuum of history that's important in architecture. And I think that typically there's kind of two schools of thought when you add on to a historic building. There's the idea that you should match it and so that you don't detract from the building. Then there's the idea that you do something that's very different so that you give the building its proper place, the historic building its proper place in time and history. And I know that that's what Culver did. They kind of separated that and they said, let's look forward as much as we are preserving the past. So I think you did a good job. And with that, I'll conclude. I don't have any rocks thrown at me or anything. And I do want to take questions, so we'll go ahead and start.
Why in the world did they create a hill and then build the library on top of the hill?
I don't know, because it's quite a set of steps. Unlike most Carnegie libraries, which would have maybe half the flight of steps. I don't know if there was concern about water, but I know there's basements in the other downtown buildings. I don't know, that's really interesting, because it is quite a, I would imagine, I think there were some photographs, some early photographs, that showed, this is pretty much at street grade, where we're at right now. So they went up a whole flight of steps. And what they often did, they had these porticos that came out that almost formed like a little porch canopy. And, I don't know if that was a desire that the Culver group had, that they didn't want that on their building, but most Carnegies have that porch, that portico that comes out and covers, and they didn't. I don't know if maybe this is part of it was just a nod to the architectural style that they said, no, let's give it more of a grand presence with that high flight of steps.
And it wasn't because the hill was there.
No, it doesn't.
Because there was a previous building that sat between the entryway and the president.
Yeah.
Here.
I mean, there feels like there's some way that moves up, but certainly not what they created, no.
There was something about climbing the steps of knowledge to the library.
So they kind of drove home that symbolic. Yeah. Well, ask my wife. I am a guy that loves perception, so I like to enter a building the way it's intended to be entered, although I did come in the back door today. But it drives me crazy that our county closed the entryway into our county courthouse, because you don't get to experience, you should be able to do something about that. I thought about that. But anyway, you don't be able to get to experience the grandeur of how it was designed to be used. So,
but they obviously weren't concerned about handicap use.
No, they weren't. No.
The Academy built a new library about 10 years ago,
Right.
with elaborate front and big stairs to go up to the main floor. And then this last year, they've taken it all down.
Oh.
And so now you go in at the ground level. And across.
The stairs are there, but they did a handicap, I think.
There's Yeah.
They spend a lot of money tearing the old entrance down.
The challenge today with ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, that accessibility rule for architects is how do you create grand entries like we're so familiar with buildings that they're 100 years old, but still make sure that it's accessible. And there's ways to do that. There's certainly ways to do that. But we look at these old buildings, and my wife will tell you we will walk all the way around the city block just so that we can walk into a church or courthouse in the way that it's intended to be used, because I just feel like that's kind of honoring what's there. You experience the architecture in a different way. You had a question.
I just wanted to say thank you for bringing up the addition. I'm looking at it in a new way now.
Okay.
I've had a very hard time figuring out where this came from and accepting the fact that they put the newer building on the Carnegie building.
Mm-hmm.
I just could not, for the life of me, get something wrapped around that. So now I've got a new way of looking at it. Thank you, because it kind of.
I know there was a lot of conflict, and I could understand what was happening here. When was this built? I don't even know if I was in
Built in 2000.
2000. Okay, so I hadn't been out of architecture school that long, and had just started kind of working in that preservation circle. So I understood what was happening. But it's like, oh no, you've got to protect the integrity of the building. I think you did. Well, you did on a number of counts because you didn't tear it down for one thing, right? So.
And it does only highlight the old building.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of does, you're right.
Right.
So I guess that's a good way to look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I've been looking into the preservation of our building, Jim Faulkner here at the library staff. And what I discovered is that there was, for quite a period of time, the Carnegie libraries were built between 1889 and 1917 was the last grant. And the architectural styles changed over the decades, and they began to feel that they were outdated buildings.
Mm.
So a lot of them were destroyed. And then preservation movements began. People started saying, look, this fabulous whole building and it's gone, why did we do that?
Right.
And preservation movements began, and they started saving many when the question came up, shall we renovate, shall we rebuild, shall we demolish, what have you. And that preservation movement gained steam, and a lot of libraries were saved until the ADA.
Mm.
And then said, well, we have
Now
these grand entrances with steps,
Right.
how can we renovate that building to accommodate that? And it was a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so the preservation movement suffered a blow,
Mm-hmm.
ironically, when we were trying to accommodate all
Yeah.
of our citizens.
Both Warsaw's Carnegie, which they did, both Warsaw and Wabash, I don't know if you're familiar with their Carnegie libraries, they did things that were very similar to how you approached it in terms of there's an entry at the main level that you can kind of go into. Wabash particularly, it's almost exactly, they've got the main building and then it's off to the side where they've done their addition. It's very nicely done. You guys kind of really went out on the limb and did this kind of very modern addition, which again I think it's kind of great. 50 years from now, people are going to be like, what was the big hubbub, about creating that addition? They'll love it. Yeah.
I think it should be noted that the three lots here, the bank, library, and the church, were all, I hesitate to say controlled, influenced by one family.
Yeah. Well, I wondered, how much of the land was, I didn't check into who the previous owner was, but I wondered how much of it was a donation and how much actually had to be raised. Because I assumed that whoever owned the land probably was in on donating.
There was a building here,
Okay.
and had a ground level entrance.
Okay. I want to say something about, because Plymouth, this was really contentious. I don't know if any of you, Jenny probably knows the stories. It was terrible. It was just terrible. They still talk about it today, how the bulldozers came in the middle of the night and tore down the Carnegie Library. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Now, I'm going to tell you, does anybody know Bill and Betty Lou Larimore? Sweetest, best people. When I moved to Plymouth, Bill and Betty were like some of the first people that I met, and Bill was the library board president and he would tell me, Kurt, there's more Carnegie libraries in Indiana than any other state. You don't need another Carnegie. And Bill, had quite a vested interest in that library. He loved that library. And, so he was very proud of the new building that was built. But now, I can't confirm this, but what I've been told is that they had so many issues with the floor separating from the walls of that building that they just felt it wasn't, worthy of saving. But I don't know.
Keep in mind that Laramore's lived in probably the only contemporary house.
That's
in
right.
all of Florida.
That's exactly right. Bill was a big fan of contemporary architecture and Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, their house was designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright.
And then another interesting thing, I don't know if we want to talk about it, but the bricks, and you can see it if you go back behind you in that little room. The bricks were hollow that were used to build this, which is, I know it's not that uncommon, but if you're not familiar with it, it sounds really counterintuitive.
Yeah, right.
You can actually see the hollow bricks in the building.
The Monterey edition is just an incredible, I mean, we really look when they put their addition onto their Carnegie, where it stopped, the old stopped and the new started, it's almost perfect. I mean, you really have to look at it. Inside, they preserved their shelving. It's just a real credit in the landscaping that they did. It's a beautiful little library.
I've seen some that are almost encapsulated entirely by the new building, which is an interesting way to preserve it as well. Marion, Indiana, theirs is kind of sort of that way. In fact, when you walk into, I think it's their Indiana history room, you're walking into the main entry of it's interesting the way they did it. Yeah.
When did the state allow us to tax people for the library?
Well, it had to have been set up prior to the Carnegies coming into play, because that was a requirement by Carnegie, is you've got to have the ability to levy a tax in order to do the library. So, if the first one was built in Goshen in 1901 in Indiana, if the first one was built in Goshen by 1901, I would think that they had to have pushed the legislature to allow that, sometime by that time.
Now, in here, does the township people pay the same taxes for the library as the town people?
I think so. It's the same levy, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've heard we're one of the only functioning Carnegie libraries in Indiana in Monterey. I mean, do you know how many there are that still have the Carnegie?
You have to read the book.
Okay.
It actually does say,
Probably.
there's a lot.
There are.
But it's probably outdated.
Jeff doesn't have enough to do. He can sit down and read this book.
Jeff Hebron has a fabulous.
I was going to look real quickly because I thought there was a number.
I'm guessing it's smaller by now than
It is, and what's nice is they go through and they actually tell you the libraries that are no longer used as libraries but used for other purposes like Goshen's. So this is a great book to go through after I kind of made fun of him for calling the wrong style. But anyway.
Well, what style, Kurt, would you say that is? I mean, really.
Contemporary. We haven't, it's almost got a little bit of postmodernism to it.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Sell it to us.
Yeah,
What's of
yeah.
interest?
What's of interest there? It's probably unfair for me to comment because I do wild, crazy things too. Not so much anymore, but everybody likes to label stuff, right? Well, the preservation movement right now is trying to figure out how to label architecture that was built between about 1970 and 1980. So we haven't quite gotten this far. All right, we just call this contemporary. But right now we're trying to, and there's like six different style words that they're using now to kind of throw around for architecture that was done in that period. Has anybody ever heard of Googie architecture? Really? Googie? No? Really? I can't imagine you haven't heard of that. It's in reference to kind of roadside type of kind of crazy architecture. So, you know,
About 6 to
like,
6.
That's fun.
yeah, stuff that's kind of out there that is, but that's Googie design.
Do you mean like the orange in Florida?
I don't know.
I mean, you know.
Oh, not like monuments, but
Oh, okay.
you know, Googie, the Howard Johnsons. Remember the Stuckies? You know, that's kind of along that line, kind of Googie architecture. It's fun to say too.
It is.
Is there any other questions?
Can our county commissioners change the
Don't
library?
say roads. Don't talk about roads. I'm leaving. What
Wind
was it?
farms, I already talked
Change
about.
the levy on,
Yeah, the library tax.
No,
no.
this is
Who can
separate,
do that?
it's a separate library district.
Yeah, right. I think that your library board would have to, and I think you have to submit it to be approved, but I don't think that goes through the county. I think that goes through the state, doesn't it?
Goes to the state.
Does it? Okay. Yeah, I'm off the hook. Nope, I can't do anything to help you, sorry.
Why do you think it should be more or less?
No, I just,
You just wondered? Okay.
I know that we talked about going outside and actually taking a look at the building from the outside, maybe pointing out some, although I'm sure my little laser pointer is not going to work outside. But we can do that if you're interested, and maybe just kind of look at it in comparison to some of the other architecture on Main Street if you like. So I know that the guys wanted a little time to be able to go out and set up the cameras out there. So if there aren't any other questions, we can do that. Pete?
One anecdote,
Yes.
Jesse Sims and I and 3 wonderful ladies were on the library board in the 60s. The original wiring, post and tube wiring, was still up in the attic.
Yeah.
Why change it if it works? Well, you were afraid it wouldn't work. One day I turned a corner at Lakeshore Drive and came down here, and there was the entire fire department plus Rochester and Winnemac all parked in front of the library. Put insulation in Saturday before. We had worked the board to save money, put insulation in the attic.
Mm-hmm.
I was certain that that's what caused the fire. Turned out it wasn't. We had a janitor who smoked and threw his cigarette back in the furnace room where we'd stored for 50 years of National Geographics. And the fire was in the National Geographic.
Well, at least it didn't do any damage.
No, it didn't do anything.
Beyond that. That's good. So you lost a few National Geographics. There's probably lots of people that would push those your way now if you're looking for collections. You have your hand up?
are there any towns that don't have a library in Indiana?
That don't have a library? Well, La Paz doesn't. Most towns of any size typically do. And a lot of times they're being brought under almost like a county-wide kind of library situation. Almost like branches. That's what I've seen happen more frequently is budgets get tighter and tighter. They do some kind of a branch kind of configuration.
In Michigan, they attach them to the schools. And the school kids then can come into them at any time, and then the public comes in a different way. And it's very useful, I think.
I like the libraries that they have, that are set on the posts on somebody's corner of their house, you see those? What do they call those, neighborhood libraries? Anyway, all right, well then we'll move to outside, just,
They've got their cameras all set up.
We actually created a deal.
Focus on the features that you said and I'll focus.
No, I didn't. Good.
Yeah, all of that, all those topics. Would that be started yesterday.
well, now you guys can what we wanted to talk to you really about with the architecture of the building, but, again, that colonial revival style, they would always have that base, and you see that how the building has a base, which is essentially the first level, the lower level. And, typically they'd have that kind of water table edge, which is that limestone cap that goes down that base. So, that colonial revival period, they wanted to kind of set it up because they were kind of celebrating the history of the United States with these grand gesture. And so then, as you move up the building, then, that main level was always kind of risen on that block. And then, almost without fail, any public building or any formal building would have that symmetrical design across the front facade, where you've got your entry in the center, and it is a very grand entry with either a portico or, in this case, just a simple broken pedimented kind of entry surround with the columns, limestone columns, and the broken pediment above. But those formal buildings of that colonial period, almost always had two windows on either side, 3 windows on either side, or 4. Not much beyond that. It was typically, they still wanted to accentuate the height of the building. So if you got too far out this way, then it started to look low and squatty. So usually there was some kind of proportion in mind when they did that with the number of windows that went out. But like I said, Culver's library is a little different in that most of the Carnegies would have that kind of pedimented, kind of porch-covered entry on the front, even if it wasn't fully expressed as a porch and read as a porch. And this is a little different, but unique. Unique, so you guys can be happy about that. And then also typical of that colonial period, what I call that bracketed cornice. The cornice is what runs around the top or where the eave of the roof comes out, and the brackets are the corbels that go around the outside edge and hold that cornice in place. That is very common. But if you look at some of the other more typical architecture, you've got kind of this simple kind of Italianate, which has more of the arched windows, and segmented arch. And obviously we were getting away from that. The Italianate style was popular in the late 1800s. And then, you move over to the Marmont building. That's what we call, it's almost that kind of mix of Tudor and Gothic kind of styles with the pointed archway over the door, this lower door. That's what we call a pointed arch, Gothic arch. So that's more of in that style. And that was not uncommon to find Carnegies built in that style, but more typically they were in the classical or the system. But just in terms of comparison, when was that built? Where's Jeff at? Come on, Jeff. When was that building built?
Which one?
The Marmont?
Oh, the cave.
No, I'm looking for a date. I thought there'd be a date there. I don't see one.
It was actually, I think it was after.
Yeah, I would think so.
That one says 1903
Yeah,
over
that was
there.
Spencer's 1903, but that, I want to say that was around the same time.
Of this?
No, as
that?
Spencer. I mean, they were within the same 10-year period.
So this is the Mentor building?
Yeah, that's the Mentor.
Yes.
So that's where the library was at, on the second
Temporarily
floor,
upstairs, yeah.
until it came over here when they were finished.
I suppose Williamsburg, that expression of colonial.
Yeah. The original colonial architecture, yeah, Williamsburg the Grand Gate study. But that colonial revival period, you can go and think about any early 20th century neighborhoods in Indiana or the United States and see colonial architecture.
There was not electricity.
Well, does anybody know?
I think the glass has changed up.
Yeah, the globe is gone.
Yeah, but I think they were
Right.
there.
Okay,
Yeah.
Patty, I've been looking at the citizens from when they got the grant. Electrification was like that year or the year
Yeah.
before.
Oh, wow, that's,
Jefferson case.
that's wonderful.
The original posted tube wiring was still in the attic of the library building, the 60s. Another member of the board and I got the insulation to insulate the library and laid it up on Saturday up over the ceiling. The next day, that week, I was coming down to turn the corner. I tell everybody this. Oh, something. Anyhow, save money, we put the insulation in ourselves. We
not the insulation we're talking about.
Were those lights out there, are those original to this?
That's what we were talking about.
Because they're gorgeous, and there's two more of them on the side as you're walking in the alleyway.
The globes would not be, they might have had a slightly different globe, but the actual light fixture, the bracket. Somebody had asked about how many Carnegies were still being used in Indiana. 107.
Wow.
That's a pretty good number.
160.
Out of 100, how many were there in Indiana?